Hi, everyone in social and political philosophy. The purpose of this brief video is that I wanted to try and clarify what I wanted you to take away from today's discussion about Locke. Sometimes what happens in a philosophy class is that a discussion can end or a class can end, and it can feel as though there's a lot of things that are unresolved. Or maybe you feel like you're sort of asking, well, what did he want me to take away from today's class? And that's bound to happen. Something about the nature of philosophy leads to that kind of thing where you might feel as though you're actually more confused than when you started. And so there's something about the nature of philosophical discussion that might lead in that direction. But in the context of a class session, it's not necessarily good if you feel as though you don't really understand what I wanted you to take away from the discussion. And so, sort of, I can acknowledge that the nature of philosophy is that it can lead to confusion, but at the same time, in the particular context of a class discussion, it's good for you guys to have a sense of what I wanted you to take away from it. So, let me try to clarify that for you. The purpose of alluding to the U.S. constitutional system, the U.S. system, was to try and sort of figure out the following. In chapter 7 of Locke, he is at pains to show that monarchy cannot be a legitimate form of government. That uh, again, having to do with the way that a monarchy conceives of the relationship between citizens and the government, and the fact that a monarchy seems to locate a lot of power and authority on the side of the monarch, which opens the door to a kind of arbitrariness on the part of the sovereign or monarch that maybe makes us a little bit, and so this is a theme that runs throughout Locke, that the parental model of rule cannot be the model for political rule. And in this chapter again, which is titled Of Political Society, Locke wants to show us what is it that political society consists in. How is political society different from the state of nature? Why do we leave the state of nature? And Locke gives us some various reasons as to why we leave the state of nature. One is the vulnerability of our natural rights, and the other one is the injustice that will arise from everyone being able to enforce the basic law of nature on their own. So that's sort of the basic reason. And then what Locke is also doing in this chapter, he's also saying that it can't be the case that the solution is worse than the problem. If the problem is the state of nature, the remedy has to actually be better. And it seems like, according to the conception of placing power in an absolute sovereign, seems to either continue the problems in the state of nature or make them worse. So again, that's Locke. Locke measures the legitimacy of government, of the creation of government, against monarchy. There's something about the monarchical system that renders anything that tries to resemble it as illegitimate, because a monarchical system doesn't seem to rely upon the consent of the governed in the way that Locke would have a political theory do. And so there's this standard against which we have constantly measure our own system. And given that our own system in the US, which we can call, a constitutional republic, a constitutional democracy, given that it bears a lot of similarities to what Locke sets up, and given our own history and our own founding, we also measure the standard against which we measure the legitimacy of government is also when it starts to seem monarchical in nature. That seems to be the standard against which we measure it. And that makes sense for obvious historical reasons given what happened at the founding of the country. So that seems to be the standard against which we measure it. And then the way that we find that standard and that legitimacy sort of working its way into everyday political discourse, when we say things like, we don't want our presidents acting like kings, and we say things like that. And my question, the reason for raising the questions I was concerned with today, had to do with when somebody says we don't want our presidents acting like kings. It's not to say that there isn't some kind of, philosophical importance to that kind of statement. But I also think that that kind of statement is said somewhat unreflectively, which is to say, not with a lot of forethought. It seems to be uttered. And so it seems less often the case that we don't often say we don't want our presidents acting like kings. Instead, we say things like we don't want Obama acting like a king and we don't want Trump acting like a king. And so my interest was simply what philosophers often do is they think about, discourse surrounding a certain phenomenon. And in particular, I'm thinking about this specific discourse, this specific language of we don't want our presidents acting like kings. And they think, what is being revealed here? What's behind that? And so we could make the case that that when somebody says that, they are saying that that there's something about our constitutional system that is being violated. Something about the constitutional system that's being violated when the president acts like a king. He's wielding too much arbitrary power without consulting the citizens about the things that he or she is doing. That's the standard. I think that's pretty clear. But when it's uttered unreflectively in everyday discourse, my question is there any deeper meaning to that? Are people actually suggesting that that they don't want their presidents acting like kings, or is it simply an expression of saying, well, I don't want Obama acting like a king because he's enacting policies that I disagree with. And so if he's enacting policies that I disagree with, that's less an expression of my concern about the legitimacy of government and more an expression of my concern about the legitimacy of the particular party or inhabitant of the White House. And so seemingly the claim would be, if somebody occupied the White House that agreed with me, I would not share the same concerns about monarchy or the government acting monarchically. And so if that's all it means, if I don't want the president acting like a king is simply the expression of a partisan preference, then I'm sort of less interested in it. But if there's more going on there, then it seems to reveal something deeply important about how our system regards itself and when it has gone too far. It seems to reveal that there is something that the monarchy is the standard against which we measure it, and it shouldn't matter what the president is doing if it seems to resemble some kind of arbitrary power that's being wielded by the occupant, regardless of the party, then we should find it problematic. Now, I think what happened today, part of the problem of what happened today, is there's this sort of philosophical discussion about what makes government legitimate. The problem then is when you try to take something from this other paradigm that's sort of more political science oriented, or what we might call electoral politics, something like political parties. When you take that and you put it on top of a philosophical discussion about legitimate government, things become murky. because then you only tend to think of things in those terms of Democrats and Republicans. And so that's sort of what I think that is what happened in class was a function of the messiness of trying to take one thing and put it on top of something else. And that is kind of how I felt. But I just wanted to be clear that raising this question was important because um, we're asking about the legitimacy of government, about how we justify government, what makes something legitimate, and how do we know when it's acting illegitimately. And I think that Locke gives us this standard. The monarchy is the mark of illegitimacy, and um, and in our own context, we also use that same measure. The question is the extent to which our own partisan preferences cover over what might be revealing something a lot deeper. And so I think, there were some good things that emerged out of the discussion. I think one of the things was one way we could think about this, and this was something that came up, is that if it's the case that they're actually, that when we say we don't want our presidents acting like kings, and we find that our presidents are acting like kings, that could be a problem with our system of government. That somehow it is dysfunctional, and that Congress is mired, the legislative branch is so mired down in fighting that it is necessitated for the president to act like a king. Right? So there's something about our own system that needs reforming, and so that the government it's not that the government is illegitimate and that we're ready to overthrow the government. It's that our own system is not functioning how it should, and it has started to look illegitimate. It appears illegitimate. It's not actually legitimate, but because of the nature of our system, something has made it look that way. And so I think that's one conclusion we can reach. But um, at the end of the day, if it's the case that when people make these claims about we don't want Obama acting like a king, we don't want Trump act, if it's just the expression of partisan preference, if that's all that's going on, then I'm less interested in it because we can get into why partisanship in political parties, but if there's more going on there and people have a problem with the government acting illegitimate regardless of who the party is, then I think there's something more. There's a more philosophical, interesting question there. Now, the other conclusion we could reach, so one conclusion we could reach is what I just discussed, is that it's not as though our government is illegitimate. It's simply that the functioning of the system is not working how it is, and it has led to the necessity for the president to have more power. But it doesn't have to be that way. Somehow, if we fixed the system, it might not lead to presidents needing to act so much like what we might consider a king. That could be one thing. We could say we need to reform our own system. Another answer could be no, actually, our own system is very dysfunctional by its very nature. That there's not something that can just be fixed about the system. It's actually the system itself that is the problem. And that if it's the system itself that is the problem, then maybe we do need to go more in the direction of monarchy. Maybe monarchy isn't such a bad thing. Maybe the president having such power isn't such a bad thing, and we actually need to reform the system, or we need to change the system. It's not that we simply need to reform it; it's that there's something about the nature of a democratic constitutional system that is messy and allows for nothing to get done, and therefore, you know, maybe we need to go more in the direction of a monarchy. And this argument about a monarchy being the measure of legitimacy is actually not a good argument. That the argument that Locke is making. In other words, maybe we need our government to be more Hobbesian in nature rather than more Lockean. That could be an argument we make. Um, again, or we could just conclude that this is all just a problem of political partisanship. And if it wasn't for the political parties, then our system wouldn't be so messy. We could also reach that conclusion. But anyways, I hope that this clarified some things. But I wanted to talk through this a little bit and sort of think about what I wanted you to take away from this. So let me just say again, big picture. Locke says the mark of legitimacy of any form of government is when it starts to wade into monarchical territory. That's the mark of legitimacy. If we find the government acting like a monarchy, if we find our political leaders acting like kings, then we know something has gone wrong. Now we can, and as a result of that, we can reach two conclusions. One is we need to reform the system from within. We need to do something about the system so that the president isn't being given so much power. So we reform the system. The other conclusion we can reach is that we actually need to change the system. Is that it's not possible to reform it, and that we actually need the president to have more power because of the dysfunction of the system, because nothing ever gets done, because the separation of powers is so complicated, and because this branch can do this and this branch can do this. Because of that, then we need to actually make the system more Hobbesian in nature. Right? We could reach that conclusion. So, anyways, those are sort of, here's the problem. Here are the two possible responses to the problem. Okay, so I hope this clarified things, and I will see you guys on Friday.